What if I told you that a global power struggle between the US, Russia, and China could decide the economic future of Africa, and even Zambia itself? The African National Congress, ANC, in South Africa has drawn closer to Moscow and Beijing. But Washington is not happy. The United States is now threatening to cut off AGOA, the African Growth and Opportunity Act, a trade deal worth billions. And here's the big question. If AGOA collapses, how will it affect Zambia, President Hakainde Hichilema, and the wider region? Stay tuned, because what looks like a battle over trade is actually a fight for Africa's future alliances. The United States has issued warnings over the African National Congress's, ANC, growing ties with Russia and China. At the center of this storm is AGOA, the African Growth and Opportunity Act, a deal that gives Africa special access to the U.S. market. If the U.S. pulls the plug on AGOA, the economic shock will be felt across the continent, including Zambia, where President Hakainde Hichilema, HH, is already balancing fragile political and economic reforms. In this video, we explore why ANC's Russia-China relationship triggered the U.S. backlash, what AGOA means for Zambia and Africa's future, how this decision could reshape the power struggle between Washington, Moscow, and Beijing in Africa. Watch till the end, because this fight is bigger than trade. It's about who controls Africa's destiny. The warning from Washington in late-night headlines and quiet diplomatic cables, a storm was brewing. The United States, long Africa's trade partner under AGOA, had issued a warning that could shake economies, fracture alliances, and redefine Africa's place on the global stage. The African Growth and Opportunity Act, known as AGOA, was designed to open America's markets to African products, from Zambian textiles to South African cars. It was meant to be an opportunity, a partnership. But in Washington's hands, it has now become a weapon. At the center of the storm are two nations, Zambia and South Africa. Both face mounting pressure for their deepening relationships with Russia and China. For the U.S., this is not just about trade, it is about global influence. Every handshake with Moscow, every signed deal with Beijing, feels like a challenge to Washington's authority. South Africa's ANC, already accused of drifting toward Moscow, stands accused of allowing Russian arms shipments and defending the Kremlin at the United Nations. Zambia, though smaller on the global stage, has found itself caught in the middle, its leadership eager for Western support, yet unwilling to sever ties with China, the country's largest creditor and builder of infrastructure. And so the warning came: play by Washington's rules or lose the golden ticket of AGOA. Inside Lusaka, whispers of panic spread among business owners who rely on AGOA markets for survival. In Johannesburg, ANC leaders publicly dismiss U.S. pressure but privately weigh the risk of losing billions in trade benefits. Across Africa, the message is clear: this is no longer simply about economics. This is about power, about loyalty, about whether African nations will choose the West or carve their own path in a world increasingly divided between East and West. The question is stark: will Zambia and South Africa bend to Washington's threat, or will they call America's bluff? This is where the story begins, with a warning from Washington that could reshape Africa's destiny. Africa's Golden Deal, the promise of AGOA when the African Growth and Opportunity Act, AGOA, was signed into law in 2000. It was hailed as a breakthrough moment. For the first time, African nations could access the vast U.S. market with little to no tariffs. Cotton, copper, textiles, cars, wine, and agricultural products all had a chance to reach American consumers. For Zambia, the promise was clear. Farmers could finally sell more cotton abroad. Small textile factories had the potential to grow into global suppliers. For South Africa, AGOA became even more significant. Its car industry, wines, and agricultural exports flourished. The deal pumped billions into the economy, created jobs, and gave ANC governments a powerful success story. Washington, too, celebrated. AGOA was not just trade, it was soft power. A way to show that America could be Africa's friend, not just China's rival. The more African goods that entered U.S. markets, the more goodwill Washington hoped to buy. But there was a catch. AGOA was never permanent. Every few years, the U.S. Congress had to renew it, and each renewal became a moment of leverage. If a country stepped out of line, Washington could threaten to cut it off. Over time, this lifeline began to look less like a gift and more like a leash. For Zambia, where foreign debt keeps the economy fragile, AGOA's benefits are a cushion against collapse. For South Africa, AGOA's auto exports support thousands of workers who cannot afford uncertainty. Without AGOA, both nations risk losing billions. And yet, AGOA has also trapped Africa in dependency. For every opportunity created, there is vulnerability. A single vote in Washington can erase decades of progress. Now, as U.S. warnings grow louder over Russia and China, the promise of AGOA stands at a crossroads. What was once a golden deal is now a bargaining chip in a much bigger game. The question remains, can Africa keep the benefits of AGOA without surrendering its independence? The Russia-China axis in the background of every U.S. threat lies a shadow, the growing presence of Russia and China across Africa. To Washington, this is the real battlefield. China arrived first, armed not with tanks, but with loans and bulldozers. Roads, railways, airports, and stadiums, all built under the banner of Beijing's Belt and Road Initiative. In Zambia, Chinese firms laid down highways and funded copper mines. In South Africa, Chinese investments poured into energy and manufacturing. The price was clear: debt, influence, and a growing sense that Beijing had become Africa's indispensable partner. Then came Russia. While China built, Moscow offered something different: security and political solidarity. From Wagner Group fighters in conflict zones to military training deals, Russia carved out influence in places the U.S. had long ignored. And in international forums like the UN Security Council, Moscow positioned itself as a defender of African sovereignty against Western pressure. Together, Russia and China offer an alternative vision, one where Africa is not bound by U.S. trade laws or Western lectures, but instead treated as an equal partner, at least on the surface. For South Africa's ANC, ties with Moscow run deep, rooted in Cold War solidarity. Russia supported the anti-apartheid struggle, and those bonds have never fully broken. For Zambia, the relationship is more recent, born out of desperation for investment and diplomatic leverage. But Washington sees something dangerous. Every new Chinese railway, every Russian weapons deal, feels like another brick in a wall pushing Africa away from the West. And so, AGOA becomes more than trade. It becomes a weapon to contain the Russia-China axis. Yet for many Africans, the picture is more complicated. To them, Washington's threats sound less like partnership and more like control. Why should Africa be forced to choose? Why can't Zambia, South Africa, and others balance all sides, trading with the West while welcoming investment from East? This is the heart of the conflict, a continent trying to chart its own path, while superpowers battle for influence on its soil. The question is not whether Russia and China will stay in Africa. The question is whether Africa will pay the price for choosing them. ANC's defiance in Pretoria, the halls of power echo with defiance. The African National Congress, ANC, South Africa's ruling party, is no stranger to pressure. For decades, it fought against apartheid, often with the quiet support of Moscow. Those ties have not been forgotten. And now, as Washington warns of consequences, the ANC has chosen to stand its ground. When the U.S. threatened to suspend South Africa from AGOA over alleged arms shipments to Russia, the ANC responded with sharp words: South Africa will not be bullied. We will choose our friends. For many within the party, this was not just about trade. It was about dignity, about refusing to be treated as a junior partner in global politics. But beneath the fiery rhetoric lies a fragile reality. South Africa's economy is already struggling under blackouts, unemployment, and corruption scandals. AGOA provides billions in benefits, particularly in the auto industry, which exports cars and parts directly to the U.S. Losing that access would devastate jobs in Durban and Port Elizabeth. And yet, the ANC leadership believes the cost of surrender would be greater. To them, bending to Washington would mean betraying their history, their independence, and their global ambitions. In Moscow and Beijing, they see allies who do not lecture them about democracy or governance, but offer investments, military partnerships, and political solidarity. Still, the gamble is risky. Critics inside South Africa accuse the ANC of sacrificing economic stability for ideological pride. Opposition parties warn that ordinary South Africans will pay the price if AGOA is lost. Washington, meanwhile, watches closely, calculating whether the ANC's defiance is posturing or a permanent shift. At its heart, the ANC's stand is about more than trade. It is about who defines South Africa's future: Washington with its conditions and benefits, or Pretoria with its right to choose its own allies. But history has taught one lesson: defiance comes with consequences. And the ANC may soon discover just how heavy that price can be. Zambia caught in the middle in Lusaka. The stakes are no less dramatic. Zambia may not command South Africa's global influence, but it has become a test case in Washington's African strategy. And today, Zambia finds itself pulled in two opposite directions. On one side lies the United States and Europe, eager to portray Zambia as a model of democratic reform under President Hakainde Hichilema. Western creditors rallied to help restructure Zambia's crushing debt, unlocking IMF loans and promising new investment. For Washington, Zambia is proof that aligning with the West still brings rewards. But on the other side stands China, Zambia's largest lender and builder of infrastructure. From copper mines to highways, Beijing's fingerprints are everywhere. Zambia cannot simply walk away from China, even if it wanted to. And then there is Russia, quietly increasing its outreach, offering defense cooperation and energy deals, dangling alternatives should the West's promises falter. This is Zambia's dilemma: play by Washington's rules and risk alienating Beijing, or deepen ties with China and risk losing AGOA's benefits. For Zambian farmers, traders, and textile workers, the outcome is personal. AGOA grants them access to U.S. markets that pay more than regional buyers ever could. If Washington cuts Lusaka off, thousands could lose livelihoods overnight. Yet at the same time, China continues to invest in physical infrastructure that Zambia desperately needs. President Hichilema walks a tightrope. Publicly, he assures Washington of his democratic credentials and Western alignment. Privately, he cannot ignore the reality that Zambia's survival depends on cooperation with both East and West. The balancing act grows harder with every new threat from Washington. Critics at home warn that HH risks becoming too dependent on Western approval, while others fear that rejecting the U.S. would plunge Zambia deeper into China's embrace. Either path carries risk, and neither guarantees stability. Zambia's position is clear. It is no longer just a small African state, but a pawn on the global chessboard. And as the U.S., Russia, and China battle for influence, Lusaka may soon discover that being caught in the middle is the most dangerous place of all. The global chessboard from Washington to Moscow, from Beijing to Lusaka, Africa is no longer a silent spectator. It has become the prize in a new global contest for power. On one side stands the United States, desperate to preserve its influence. With AGOA, sanctions, and aid packages, Washington still has tools to reward allies and punish defiance. But every warning it issues risks sounding like a threat, and every threat risks pushing Africa further away. On the other side looms China, wielding economic muscle through infrastructure, loans, and trade. The Belt and Road Initiative has redrawn maps across the continent, binding African economies to Beijing's supply chains. For Zambia, China is not just a partner, it is a creditor too large to ignore. For South Africa, it is a gateway to alternative markets that bypass U.S. control. Then comes Russia, often underestimated but increasingly bold. Through military training, arms deals, and symbolic solidarity at the UN, Moscow positions itself as Africa's defender against Western hypocrisy. Its influence may not match China's, but its presence carries political weight, especially among liberation movements like South Africa's ANC. This is the global chessboard, and every move matters. A single UN vote on Ukraine, a defense deal signed in Moscow, a trade delegation welcomed in Beijing. To outside powers, these decisions are about strategy. But to Africans, they are about survival. The irony is clear. Africa, long exploited and sidelined, now finds itself courted like never before. Superpowers send envoys, promise billions, and compete for goodwill. Yet the danger remains that Africa becomes a battlefield of influence rather than a master of its own destiny. For Zambia and South Africa, the chessboard is personal. Each move they make could protect their economies or invite retaliation. Each alliance could strengthen their sovereignty or chain them to new masters. The world watches, waiting to see. Will Africa play as a pawn moved by others, or as a player shaping its own game? The price of defiance, every act of defiance, carries a cost. For South Africa's ANC and for Zambia's fragile economy, the warning from Washington is clear. Stand too close to Moscow and Beijing, and AGOA could vanish overnight. But what would that actually mean? In South Africa, the consequences would be immediate. The auto industry, one of the country's crown jewels, exports billions of dollars worth of vehicles and parts to the United States under AGOA. Without it, factories in Durban and Port Elizabeth could grind to a halt. Tens of thousands of workers, already facing an unstable economy, would be pushed into unemployment. In Zambia, the threat cuts differently, but just as deep. Cotton farmers, textile exporters, and small traders rely on duty-free access to the U.S. market to survive. Remove AGOA, and Zambia's goods become too expensive to compete. Entire communities could be plunged further into poverty, undoing years of slow economic recovery. The irony is striking. Washington claims to defend democracy and prosperity, but its punishment would fall hardest on ordinary Africans, the very people it says it wants to help. Meanwhile, the elites who negotiate deals with Russia and China may feel little of the pain. And yet, for leaders in Lusaka and Pretoria, defiance may still seem worth the price. Why? Because bending to Washington risks something even greater, the loss of sovereignty. To accept U.S. conditions would be to admit that Africa cannot choose its own friends, cannot decide its own destiny. This is the dilemma. Pay the price of defiance or pay the price of submission. Either way, the burden will not be carried equally. For Africa's workers, farmers, and households, the threat of losing AGOA is not an abstract geopolitical game. It is about food on the table, jobs in the city, and dignity in daily life. And as Washington weighs its next move, one question remains. Will the U.S. risk alienating millions of Africans in order to win a battle against Moscow and Beijing? A new African order? From the ashes of crisis, a question emerges. Could the U.S. threat over AGOA ignite something bigger, the birth of a new African order? For more than 2 decades, AGOA has tied Africa's economic fate to Washington. It offered opportunity, yes, but also dependency. A single vote in the U.S. Congress could decide whether an African farmer's crops reached American markets or rotted at home. For many, that dependency is no longer acceptable. Enter Russia and China. Moscow promises solidarity, weapons, and energy deals. Beijing promises loans, infrastructure, and access to its massive consumer markets. Together, they offer Africa a chance to break free from Washington's grip, or so it seems. But freedom always comes with a price. China's loans have left nations like Zambia drowning in debt. Russia's promises of security often come with political strings. And both Moscow and Beijing, just like Washington, pursue their own interests first. Still, the shift is undeniable. Africa is no longer waiting for permission. The rise of BRICS, where South Africa sits as a founding member, signals a continent ready to rewrite the rules. Zambia, too, is finding new spaces at global summits once closed to it. These are small steps toward a future where Africa shapes its own alliances rather than choosing between East and West. But the path is uncertain. Will this new order mean true independence, a multipolar world where Africa negotiates as an equal? Or will it simply mean trading one master for another? For South Africa's ANC, for Zambia under President Hakainde Hichilema, and for millions across the continent, the answer has yet to be written. What is clear is that Washington's threat has accelerated a reckoning. The age of Africa as a pawn may be ending. The age of Africa as a player may just be beginning. And as the world watches, one question remains. Will Africa rise to seize its destiny, or will history repeat itself under a new empire's shadow?